Good morning, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this first podcast and author in Indica Books live hour with Sriram Balasubramanian, and this is our first author interview Q&A of 2023. I've been really looking forward to doing this Q&A for a variety of different reasons. So the book, as you can see in the background, is Kautilyanomics for Modern Times. It's been published by Bloomsbury, and it has been a national bestseller. The publisher has rated it as a national bestseller. It's been on Amazon. It's been number one in economic history of India in that category for pretty much 2022. It has a foreword by Sri Vivek Roy and such eminent personalities as Sanjeev Sanyal, Dr. Meghnad Desai, Shekhar Gupta, Dr. Niranjan Rajadhyaksh have blurbed it in glowing terms. So that alone is reason, I think, for people to want to pick this book up. But then the subject itself, right? So going through this book, the fact is that there are many, many books that have been written on Kautilya, on Chanakya, as he's also known. But this treatment of Kautilya as an Arthashastra is somewhat different. It is, I would say, almost this is unique in the way it has approached the topic and the way it has relied on original references to make certain points. So with that, I will read out a brief introduction of the author. So Sriram is an economist and author based at one of the leading international monetary institutions in the world. And his key areas of interest include global macroeconomics, economic history, socioeconomic trends in emerging markets, and Indic dharmic culture. He has contributed to many international publications such as Foreign Policy, Wall Street Journal, Vox EU, and CNBC TV 18 as an independent columnist and commentator. This, by the way, is his second book. He is the author of Jamba, the Joint Family, and he has also been featured in podcasts by Bloomberg and interviewed by newspapers, including The Hindu and the New Indian Express. And he was an international junior chess player and is an alumnus of Columbia University, New York. Sriram, a warm welcome to this Indica Books Q&A.
Thank you, Abhinav, for the kind introduction. Namaste to your viewers. It's a pleasure to be part of Indica. It's almost being home. Indica and Indica Academy has been integral to my journey as both as an intellectual as well as an author. So thanks to Harikiran Varlamani and you guys for doing the great work that you're doing.
Awesome. Thank you for the kind words. And yes, I should have added that please do follow us on Twitter and Facebook. We are on Twitter at Indica Books. We are on Facebook at facebook.com/groups/Indic Book Club. And we're also on Instagram. So look us up and you can follow us for news on books, on author Q&As and book promotions and everything. So Sriram, let me start off with the very, very first, very basic question. There are literally hundreds of books that have been published on Chanakya, on Chanakya Niti, on the Arthashastra, including some very, very formidable ones also by Sri Rangarajan that you have quoted extensively in your book itself. Now, I kind of, revealed the plot by saying that this is your treatment is very different, but do tell us your motivations for writing this book, number one. And second, how did you go about, or what was your intent in approaching this matter in a manner that was not only, different and unique, but also very relevant?
Yeah. Thank you, Abhinav, again. So that kicks off with a very interesting question. You're right. The Arthashastra is probably the most debated or discussed text in contemporary discourse, especially on the geopolitical and socio-economic front. And so there are lots of books on Kautilya and Chanakya. But the reality is, the number of translations which is there on Kautilya and Chanakya of the Arthashastra is fairly limited. You mentioned about Rangarajan. There are about 4 to 5 translations of the book. One is initial one by Shama Shastri and then T.G. Shastri. Kangli and Ragarajan. But most of these people, in fact, all of these people, are either Sanskritam scholars or generalists who are good at translation. Um, but none of them are subject matter experts. So I think that's the root cause of what I'm trying to address. Because I was working on Angus Madison's data set on economic history, for my own professional work. When I was looking at the database, I mean, most people quote about Angus Madison, but very few people look at what he has actually done. Probably because they don't have the subject matter expertise, or they are probably not interested in due diligence. But I sort of, did some analysis on the database. And Angus Madison's argument is that, from 0 CE onwards till about 17th century CE, India and China were the top countries in terms of macroeconomic indicators. When I mean macroeconomic indicators, I'm talking about GDP per capita, on that sort of indicators. And the general contrarian view to this is that industrialization didn't really kick in during that time, and most of this was a proxy for population, right? And I found that logic to be to not pass the smell test, as I call it, because there is a lot of anecdotal evidence, secondary evidence from Chinese embassy notes, Greek embassy notes, Greek travelers, Peripulus of the Earthian Sea, for an example. A lot of these travelers have written accounts on how prosperous Bharat was during this time. So, and you could see that in a lot of other civilizations which are inspired by Bharat, including Cambodia, in Southeast Asia and other places. And of course, if you look at the physical evidence of, for example, the Chola Empire and the Brihadishwara Temple, an example, you see sort of an engineering marvel which is even, appreciated today. So there had to be, so it was quite clear to me that during this time, that prosperity was the norm, and Bharat was probably central to the global narrative, and that's why people were seeking to come here, to come to Bharat. So in that sense, my philosophy, my thinking, my intuition was that this wouldn't be something abstract. It's not something random that had happened, and then there had to be an economic / socioeconomic framework for this process to actually happen. And that's where I chanced upon the Arthashastra. And Arthashastra, as your listeners might know, is a 3rd century BCE text. And I wanted to sort of understand what was Kautilya's thinking and what is his economic philosophy. And guess what? Once I was trying to do this, I realized that very little, if not nothing, is written about Kautilya's economic philosophy. Right? For all the talk on the Arthashastra, you have a lot of talk on the Rajya Shastra or the Rashtra Shastra, or the so essentially the political element of Chanakya, or the self-help element of Chanakya, or the fictional part of Chanakya. Okay, but there's a reason why it's called the Arthashastra, right? If not, they would have called it Rashtra Shastra if it's about statecraft, or Rajya Shastra, for example. So it's called the Arthashastra because primarily Kautilya was one of the pioneering thinkers who put wealth creation as central to a philosophy of governance, and economic prosperity is central to the philosophy of governance in a society. So in that sense, the book is all about that, in my view. But very little was written. One book by Balbir Sihagji, who is a PhD from MIT, an emeritus professor now, he had talked about the academic side of why Kautilya was far ahead of Adam Smith. It's sort of an academic book. But there wasn't a book which common people can consume. So this sort of inspired me to address this gap. And that's how I bought the idea of Kautilyanomics, the idea of Dharmic capitalism, the central role of Dharma, and all these things, which was integral to Kautilya's thinking. So the output, the Arthashastra gave me the output, I derived the framework, and then contextualized it to right science. So these were the sort of inspirational, points of the book. In my
So, Sriram, you hit upon a few very, very interesting points. Let me take them one by one. The first is that the role of okay, so you said that the Arthashastra is basically a text dating back 2,300 years, but the Arthashastra, as I think almost all of us understand it today, owes itself to a translation of the text or the rediscovery of the text by Shamas Shastri almost more than 100 years back, right?
Yeah.
Now, was there okay? So that is one. The second one was, and we'll come to back to this point in just a little bit. The second point was very interesting, which is the study of Angus Maddison that you quoted. And there are, I think, 2 points I want to bring up. So the first one is where he says that basically from the beginning of recorded human civilization, when you can go as far as you can go back to about the 17th century or thereabouts, till just before the start of the Industrial Revolution, India and China were the leaders in the world GDP, which you say he implies was the result of nothing more than a simple demographics leading to more economic prosperity. But firstly, how credible, how authoritative are the numbers put out by Angus Maddison, and are there any counterfactuals to those numbers, or do we basically these are generally accepted truths based on his research and all? Can you tell us first a little bit about that?
Yeah. So Angus Maddison doesn't bring the demographic debate or the counter theory. Angus Maddison just gives the data as it is.
So you're saying late other people who analyzed this data came up with this interpretation?
Correct. So I'm saying some of the critics who sort of want to undermine this data, the counter narrative to it is that it could be a proxy for population, right? In fact, I find Madison's data to be fairly credible. It's very well accepted. OECD published this report that he published. He's no more now, but his entire work is available on the Norwegian Research Institute's website, and his lifetime is stellar work on economic history. So he's a very well reputed economic historian, and his data set is fairly accepted. In fact, I would go to the extent that, intuitively, again, I don't have analytical sort of evidence at the moment that probably some of his estimations are underplaying the amount of underestimating the prosperity that was seen, because the quantum of measurement is again questionable, right? So let's take, for example, the wealth in some of the temples that we have today, which were primarily not just religious institutions, but were financial institutions. The corporate guilds, the Srinis, in all these places. Most of that, wealth is probably not picked up in some of these data sets. So my intuitive view is that is, if at best what we can say is it's an underestimation rather than an overestimation.
So with that, now, as far as, and this is something that Sri Vivek Debroy mentions in his foreword to your book, that Kautilya was not the first one to write about this. There were people who had preceded him, and Kautilya acknowledges it as such. And he was basically one in a line of several people who had written on these topics. Now, the Mahabharata, for example, also talks about governance, and the Mahabharata itself is described as, among various things, as a Dharma Shastra, as an Artha Shastra, but Kautilya's work is one that is exclusively devoted to these issues of economics, of governance, and so on. Now, at about you say that at about 6,000 shlokas, this the entire original Artha Shastra is basically, I would say, 600 to 700 pages of translated text. Now, can you give us a brief rundown of how the Arthashastra itself is organized?
Yeah. So, see, the text is written in dense Sanskritam, right? So, one needs to first have an understanding of Sanskritam, at least a basic understanding. So, I had done a diploma a couple of years back, and I've been refining my language a bit more over a period of time. So, I have some sense of the language. I wouldn't call myself an expert. So you have to engage with the experts, with the Sanskrit scholars, first to have an understanding of the text, and then uh, the text is divided into a variety of chapters. So each chapter looks into one area of say statecraft. So Kautilya talks about legal prescriptions in one chapter, law and order in one chapter. He talks about governance in another chapter. He talks about the state in another chapter. And then he talks about principles, economic principles like trade and all that in another chapter. So each chapter sort of goes into some of these areas, chapter by chapter. But the challenge really is that there are ideas spread across chapters, which might be relevant to his economic understanding. So let me give you an example, right? So let's take the Kautilya's view on labor contracts, right? Labor contracts, Kautilya believes that labor contracts is something that everyone needs to have, even a daily wage laborer and an employee, some level of understanding of what the work is and what quantum of work and all these things. So that is written mainly in the chapter on law and order and legal prescriptions. But that's a primary and economic principle of labor arbitrage and enhancing labor's role in society. So you could and then empowering the poor as well, because most poor laborers will gain agency in economic terms, by having, they feel empowered by having such a document or a contract in place. So what I'm trying to say is that there are a lot of these ideas which are spread across these chapters. So when one derives a framework, one tries to go into Kautilya's mind and derives a framework. One needs to find consistency of ideas across the board, and then those consistency of ideas need to be applied into the framework, right? So that is the challenge. So one is to deal with the text, which I mentioned as many chapters, many shlokas, working with Sanskrit scholars, and then finding consistency of ideas across board, and then using the consistency of these set of ideas that he has across board, deriving a framework which is consistent with his worldview, and then applying the framework to both his ideas as well as what we have today to see the relevance. So that's where the challenges are, multifold challenges are in doing this.
So, in the context of and when you talked about the issue of relevance, I want to go and talk a little bit about the sustainable growth and welfare, the chapter that you have on this topic. And one of the tables that you have is on compensation or salaries. And this is on page 167, where salaries for different positions are mentioned. And at 48,000 panas, it is the salary of the king's guru, the crown prince, the king's mother, queen, counselors in civil service, chief of defense of the armed forces, and then going all the way down to the servants in charge of animals and birds, labor foremen, bodyguards of the king, miners, king's other servants, and all, to 60 panas. Now, this, if we look at, if we use, modern constructs of how inequality in corporate compensation is measured, or the variance that exists by looking at what the lowest paid employee in a company earns to what the CEO of a company earns, in taking the total compensation into account. How would you analyze, or how would you look at this salary the spectrum of compensation from the from a servant in the palace to the king and the crown prince. How does Kautilya look at it? How do you look at this in a modern context?
Yeah. So if you really, there are a couple of things on this, right? So what we are talking about is the list of, say, salaries for governmental employees or people by the state in those times. Uh, there are a couple of distinct points here. Number one, look at the range of the salary. So, for example, the range is from almost 48,000 panas to 60 panas. It's a huge range, right?
Right.
So he is very careful in sort of segregating and providing a large salary range depending on the need, depending on the authority, and depending on the position of people. So an example of this is the 48,000 panasis for his key ministers and people, his councillors and things like that, right? That's another example of today's Singapore, for example. If you take Singapore, Singapore has this philosophy of paying their ministers extremely high salaries to prevent them from being corrupt. Because once the ministers are, in fact, they're on par with the private sector salaries for their grade. So Kautilya, in that sense, also understood that his ministers and his, had to be paid quite a high amount to ensure that they're held to much higher standards and they don't, indulge in corrupt activities. So that could be one of the reasons. What I'm trying to say is that the thinking in the range of salaries and the breadth of it is one important point, right? Another point is, for each of these classifications, Kautilya has a minimum wage by itself. So if you look at grade A, for example, the lowest is 4,000 panas, right? For grade B, the range is from 3,000 to 250 panas is the lowest range. And for grade C, the lowest is 60 panas, right? So what he does is, for each type of gradation, he sort of has a minimum cap on how much wage that he is willing to give to these people. And he also, so this shows his level of flexibility in the idea of minimum wage itself. It's not a single construct for people, and it's something that keeps evolving.
So you raised an interesting point when you said that in Singapore, for example, the salaries of ministers is very high because the intent being that if they have to be held to higher standards, then
Correct.
compensation should not ever come up as an excuse. In the context of this employment, I believe you mentioned at some place that the government sort of employees of the state could be tenured employees.
Correct.
And Kautilya recognized that the incentive for putting in the same kind of hard work for employees could potentially diminish if they
Correct.
knew that employment was permanent. So he does have something to say about that. I believe it's something like there should be checks or some sort of a system to make sure that they adhere to this to the sort of implicit contract that existed between an employee and the
Correct. In
state.
fact, let me quote that. It's in page 170 again. It's a Kautilyan Tantra. It says, quote and unquote, Kautilya was aware of human tendencies and of risk aversion and shirking, which is basically leisure seeking. Therefore, middle and lower grade employees who might be highly risk averse might seek job tenure. He recommended that this group of employees who were honest, efficient, and loyal be made permanent. But he also advocated inspection so that the employees do not get slacked after getting tenure. So he sort of understood, the thinking behind. Again, it's important to understand the thinking because we don't have Kautilya in front of us today. So the thinking behind is he wants to ensure that they are meritorious and they do a good job, and but he also ensures that they're not slacking. And I think this would apply much higher for the folks at the higher level who are getting higher salaries, right? Because they're put to a much higher standard because of the salary.
So in this context, right now, let's talk a little bit about the enforcement of contracts because
Right.
if an employee is made permanent and the expectation is that they'll continue to work and not slack off. But on the other hand, if they do, then Kautilya here suggests inspection so that employees do not get slack after getting tenure. And then you also have a very detailed system of contracts and what was the penalty for breaking these contracts, that I think is something you have covered in the next chapter, and where you talk about, for example, property law enforcement. So there are
Correct.
two questions here. One was how so okay, if I look at this in the context of modern India, there is no shortage of contracts, there's no shortage of laws. In fact, a recent study by the Observer Research Foundation found something like, more than 17,000 regulations that a company would potentially need to follow in India. So there's no shortage of laws, but we know the malaise affecting the Indian system of governance is the enforcement, the timely enforcement of these contracts.
Yeah.
Is there any sense that you get that in in the Kautilyan economy, this was an issue or not an issue? And
No, it
how was
certainly
this discovered?
it
Enforced?
certainly was an issue, and that's why Kautilya state is a very, you know, strict and rule enforcing state, right? So this is where I take on some of the, proponents of Kautilya, who sort of smear him with his Machiavellian streak, who also talk about, him having, crazy punishments and all that. But one of the reasons to have some of these punishments, one is context. We're talking about 2,500 years ago, and what is acceptable today and what is acceptable then are two different things. Second is he believed in the idea of a state which is very strict in enforcing rules and regulations. So that's where the idea of Matsya Nyaya also comes in. So,
Yeah.
when you talk about Matsya Nyaya, we are essentially, in very simple terms, you're talking about a big fish eating a small fish and avoiding Matsya Nyaya. So in order to avoid Matsya Nyaya, what does Kautilya propagate? One of the things that he mentioned is the enforcement of rule of law and ensuring that rule of law is implemented without due favor to anyone. That is very important because he also believed that unless there is a legal system which is implementable, and unless people have confidence in the system, even businesses and economic prosperity would take a back seat because businesses would want to gain confidence in the system. The same thing with common people and the lower sort of smaller businesses who are engaging with the system. They also need confidence in the system. So he believed in the rule of law and implementation of rule of law as central to his sort of philosophy. And in that prism, that's why the implementation was very strict and the punishment was also extremely strict. So that
And
these were the
this,
regulations that we had. If we cross those
right.
regulations, the punishments are very severe.
And this is something that you mention on page 200, and you say that if Dand is not employed, it gives rise to the condition of Matsya, for in the absence of a chastiser, the strong devour the weak, says Kautilya.
Yeah,
So,
that's true because he. So that's why I talk about this a bit more in the next section on debt resolution, but the entire principle of dealing with the Samadhana Vedant principle approach that he has for debt resolution is similar to what he has even for this, where it's not like he goes straight into the Dandaniti part of it. He also there are stages towards Dandaniti, and he believes that without a sense of fear of the system, of consequences of these regulations, people wouldn't follow them in line. So I think he focused a lot on implementation of the rule of law, which is what probably
so this is a very interesting view, because one can look at it both ways. For example, one can say that, if society was ideal and just, then why do you need so many details and how many laws and regulations and all? But I think the counter argument that I tend to subscribe to is that it was only in the framework of well-defined laws and the uniform application of those and enforcement of those laws that it allowed a free and fair society to develop and flourish.
Yeah, look, this notion that somehow 2000 years ago, human fallibility was somehow lesser compared to what it is today is in my view not true. I think as human beings we were as flawed then as we are today. Probably the extent, range, and the type of flaws we have today are probably different, right? So Kautilya sort of understood that very well because he was primarily a political economist. So he saw economic prosperity as a base for political success. There's no doubt about it, right? And so his view in that sense was to showcase look at it from that angle, from a pragmatic angle. And on this notion of, his, the Arthashastra as a text, you need to also understand that there are many things in the Arthashastra. But it doesn't necessarily mean that all of this was implemented, right? Kautilya was he probably understood that political governance and political economy is a very complex subject, right? And probably the Mauryan dynasty used only some of these things as part of their political philosophy and policies. So Kautilya himself felt the need for just, writing a book on its own to illustrate all the ideas that he thought could be implemented. What I'm trying to say is that, at any point of time, it doesn't necessarily mean that the text was used one-to-one. In fact, the Arthashastra itself doesn't mention very little, if not nothing, about the Mauryan dynasty. It's a context-agnostic text. So, in that sense, he had written it as sort of a template from which people can pick and choose on what are the things that they want to use. So that is another angle you need to, look at.
Correct.
Because when you're drawing linkages between the Mauryan Empire and the Arthashastra, you need to be a bit careful because there's no one-to-one, match of whatever the Arthashastra said the Mauryans implemented. So they might have used some or large elements of it in some cases. I think that's what Kautilya also expected, when putting this treatise, that people can pick and choose what they feel comfortable with the underlying philosophy of Dharma and things like that.
So let's come to one of the I think the last chapter before the summary and insights, and this is titled Kautilya's View of the Post-Pandemic World. Tell us a little bit about this, because one of the key points that you cover, or that you allude upon in this chapter, is the notion of debt. And debt was used as one lever to provide relief to the lowest strata of society, the lowest economic strata of society. But essentially, you also write that overall the level of India's public debt has remained stable despite COVID-19, and the country is expected to register strong growth in the foreseeable future. Now, from the time you possibly wrote these lines to now, I would say at least 6 months or a year have passed. So we now know that basically what you wrote has come to pass, that India's quality of debt, or the debt ratio, is not worsened. How do you relate this to the Kautilyan worldview?
Yeah. So see, that chapter, the penultimate chapter, is sort of my open-ended discussion with the reader, or open-ended brainstorming.
Right, because you have a set of questions that you have put in at the end of
Correct.
the chapter. That
Correct.
right.
Correct. That's to highlight my own infallibility, put it that way, in the sense that I'm an advanced reader of Kautilya's Arthashastra, but by no means do I know everything. So these are ideas which I am thinking on my mind, which I want to also share with the readers, so that people can think about some of these questions. So on the idea of debt, it's interesting because first of all, one needs to understand that debt was not a taboo subject in our ancient past. A lot of other civilizations, debt is still an issue, right? In ours, borrowing money was not a taboo. In fact, Kautilya has a lot of, I mentioned in the book, in the chapter on labor contracts, I think, contractual, in contracts where we talk about creditor and debtor relationship. What are some of the, how much interest rate does he charge on some of the loans that were taken? How do you resolve some of these loans? So there is a system in place which helps even on debt resolution. So the idea of IBC that we have today, for example, the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, was at some level there during Kautilya's time itself. The thinking was there. So the idea of risk taking was encouraged, so that if people go into debt and they say had some issues, they always had a backup system which sort of resolved. So the idea of debt being a taboo itself is a misnomer. It's in Kautilya's times, it is fairly acceptable norm of financing, and people were attuned to. They had systems to even resolve bankruptcy and debt and things like that. So that's one point. The second point is, I think the challenge really is on debt sustainability is at a personal level. Kautilya is very clear. He believes that one can indulge in debt financing and use debt for holding up businesses or for expanding businesses, but that needs to be sustainable over a period of time. So he sort of believes in this idea of sustainable debt, that you have to do it with caution, but it can be used to expand and sort of promote businesses in the short run, right? So this is at a personal level. So that's his view. But at the state level, right, because of the fact that the sovereign was very different during those times, and the sort of democratic state that we have today, the sovereign structure is different. How would Kautilya envisage something like sovereign debt, for example, right? Debt by the state, right? That is still something that I'm contemplating and sort of thinking about using some of his ideas. But the key really is for some of these questions which I've asked, whether it's on artificial intelligence, whether it's on debt or demographics, the important part is to look at Kautilya's thinking, right? When I mean thinking, what are his ideas over the text on other issues which are consistent, right? So, for example, we know that he's consistent with trade. He's consistent with engaging with the world, right? He provides incentives for traders. He provides incentives for imports. He provides tax breaks. So he believes in engaging with the world. So that's a principle you can see across the text, right? Second, his focus on empowering the poor, welfare and empowering the poor, right? Avoiding Matsya, doing things like targeted transfers, empowering people through labor contracts. So he provides support for welfare. So that's a consistent theme, right? And then you have a theme which talks about a state which is strong, implements rule of law, but allows independence to individual economic activity. That's another theme. And then the idea of sustainable growth is a theme that you see across the text. So what I'm trying to say is we have to look at these themes and the thinking points and then bring together to understand how you will view the idea of, say, sovereign debt, which is not explicitly mentioned because of contextual differences and organizational differences of the state, but the principles are the ones that we need to sort of bring to the table. So that's where, for example, on artificial intelligence, which is another thing which I've mentioned, how would, say, Kautilya derive an artificial intelligence policy, right? If you really think about it, the principles that I mentioned, engaging with the world, protecting the poor and the lower rungs, empowering them, not ensuring that job losses are there, engaging the world for a more refined discussion on AI, and lastly, on having rules which are fairly implementable and strict, but giving the space to be innovative and things like that. That would be sort of the approach to AI, for example. That's how I think we need to, go beyond the text in a sense to look at his thinking and then apply some of these ideas in today's times.
Correct, because his text, as you say, is not really rooted in a particular time in history. That doesn't make mention of the modern empire. So, and the fact that it builds upon previous texts should suggest to us that it is equally well a conceptual framework that can be applied. And as your book points out, large parts of it do still read very relevant in a modern context. Yeah, you were saying.
Another, a quick point, Abhinav, is that, see, you can't also expect a text 2,000, 3,000 years ago to talk in the language that you and I define today as logic. That's a fundamental point, right? We
Absolutely.
think that our way of understanding today is the prima donna of existence, which is
Exactly.
arrogant at worst and plain stupid at best, because the thinking, the way the text is structured, the way it is communicated, is for an audience 2,000 years ago of what they defined as logic, of what they defined as a construct. So, we have to extract it to. You have to extract the text into our logical construct, which is what this book attempts, for us to have a one-to-one discussion, one-to-one comparison of today's times, right? So that's where the idea of Tantra Yukti is something that I mentioned, which is a technique. I mentioned it in passing in the book. It's a technique that is used to extract the Arthashastra in today's logical framework. So why I'm saying this is,
right.
Yeah,
No,
just one point.
go ahead.
Why I'm saying this is, in the text, you're not going to see explicit mention of all these things in the terminology that we define today. So, for example, let's take debt sustainability. You're not going to see the word debt sustainability anywhere in the translation, right? But the theme behind debt sustainability will be there in the essence of the text. And I think that's the level we need to go to. We are stuck in these exterior layers, and we need to go further in to sort of understand the thinking behind it.
Absolutely, and in that context, I'll have perhaps some advice for our viewers also is that beware of the tendency of some to dismiss the Arthashastra by focusing, or I would say fixating on the particulars of the language to make the case that it is not a relevant text. But I think what you have said is something that that anyone reading this book or the Arthashastra in general should keep in mind, that look at the essence, look at the conceptual frameworks, and don't get hung up on the specific words, because as you said, something that was written for an audience 2,500 years back it simply cannot. I mean, you cannot read a text written 200 years back and not wonder the language would read so different. I mean, Shakespeare wrote in English, but the English that he wrote in and the English that we write today are almost completely different. So one other point that I wanted to talk about, one last point, was in the area of wealth creation. Right. Yes. In the area of wealth creation, one of when I was going through your acknowledgements, I see that you have acknowledged and thanked Sumedha Verma Oja ji for her map of the Uttar Path and Dakshin Path. This is one of the last things I would like to end on. Tell us a little bit about the Uttar Path and the Dakshin Path. For most of us, hopefully, at least the Indian audience will know that, but just for the sake of clarity and its applicability in your book, tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you. So, I would like to thank both Suraja and Sumedha ji for giving us that graph, which is very important. And Sumedha ji's work, I think, for people who don't know, she's done a lot of work on Kautilya, and that's again. Such research work is really helpful and motivational for scholars such as me. So basically, I mean, in very simple terms, these were trade routes, the Uttarapath and Dakshinapath, from connecting almost the north and to the south of India. And these routes were used for a wide range of things, but from economic sort of, you can put them as modern highways, but these were routes which were used by some of these traders to trade products across the country. Uh, and it's also important to note that, the idea of trade was very omnipresent during those times. And there's a physical evidence for us even today. So, for example, if you look at all the temples in the coastal areas, right? Compare the temples in the coastal areas to the temples inward. The temples in the coastal areas have far more wealth, in terms of jewelry and things like that, compared to some of the temples inward. Uh, there's a reason for that because much of the trade, that you see, happened, through shipping channels and maritime routes and things like that. And these sort of institutions nearer the coast provided sort of financial institutions for transactions and things like that. And the inland exercise is what these routes represent, where the inland movement of trade through these routes were also connecting the ends of Bharat, as you might call it. So these trade routes, are an important sort of important entity, I would say, during those times. And in fact, I will try to quote a paragraph from the book so that people can get a better sense of what I'm talking about. So here's the quote. In page 86, I say, there are thousands of kilometers of long trade routes that connected almost all of India through various highways and linkages. The Mahabharata gives instances of various such land routes with references to the Uttarapatha and Dakshinapatha, the Northern Highway and the Southern Highway, which connected inland commercial centers in the various ports. Ancient trade routes were broadly classified as Mahapatha, Vanikapatha, and Rajapatha, respectively. While the Mahapatha connected the four corners of India through its trading routes, the Vanikapatha especially designed zones of economic activity. So you had designed zones of economic activity. While the national highways were used to connect various corners of India, the Vanikapathas were used as a specialized economic zones through which trade was conducted. They were dominated by satta, which is basically caravans, which carried a wide range of commodities and food source products to the various Vanikapathas in each of the states in each region. Moreover, in the Uttarapatha, the trade routes connected the Janapadas of each region, sort of districts, or states, or whatever you want to call it in today's parlance. Whereas the Dakshinapatha was largely used for connecting inland centers and ports, especially for commodities. They are highlighted in the map. So these routes were not just used for physical movement; they had some specialized purposes. So the Vanikapathas, for example, had specialized economic sort of zones and activities. So within these routes, there is specialization of various products and commodities and things like that, which they used for greater sort of mobility. In fact, Kautilya mentions that for traders who are moving, who are coming from abroad, he provides protection with labor and people for transportation of some of these goods through the caravans from point A to point B. That's another incentive he provides for traders. If there are any issues in terms of transportation during those times, he has people to support them so that they feel enabled and they can trade their products without any safety issues. So answering question, there are indeed such routes. There is a thinking on trade. There was in fact, this point on the Greek current account deficit. There is, one of my research scholars whom I work with mentioned this to me recently, that the Greek current account deficit was linked to India's exports. Because the large sections of these coins and exports from India contributed significantly to the Greek current account deficit, because most of these things were traded. So it was a similar scenario of a globalized world as today, but only difference is there was a lag, obviously, because it took some time for these products to go through shipping channels and things like that. But the underlying philosophy, the principles, are all there to see from whatever that I've seen, whatever that I mentioned.
Absolutely. So, in conclusion, I'll quote a couple of lines from Mr. Shekhar Gupta, who has said that uh, in this book, Sriram explains why Kautilya is more relevant today as the father of modern economic thinking. It is a must-read book for everyone, not just limited to policymakers and intellectuals. I will wholeheartedly endorse his statement because This is a book that you can, you don't have to have, an economic background to read this book. As long as you have an interest in economic matters, I think this book will appeal to all. Uh, it is also, I think, written in a way that you can pick up a chapter of interest, read that. It is a fairly self-contained chapter. The chapters are fairly self-contained. Obviously, it helps if you read the book in a sequential order. But this is, I think, a must-have book for anyone interested in understanding modern economy and its ties to economic thinking more than 2,000 years ago. So, Sriram Balasubramanian, thank you so much for coming on to this Indica Books Q&A, for sharing your thoughts and answering your questions on the book and the economic thinking prevalent at the time and its applicability and relevance to today's times. Folks, you can get this book from all bookstores on Amazon, Flipkart, and other places. And this is also available in paperback and in ebook form. It's been published by Bloomsbury, and I strongly recommend this book. So, thank you, everyone, and thank you, Sriram, for coming onto this podcast.
Thank you for providing me this opportunity. It was a very good discussion. I enjoyed it. I just have one request for your listeners. Please buy the book in Amazon and review the book on Amazon. Indic thoughts. One of the ways it can be spread is when people read and review these books, so that there's greater traction and there's greater awareness. And I think that's the main aim for the book. My main aim in this entire exercise is over the last 4 or 5 months, while promoting the book and while writing the book for almost 5 years, is to ensure that future generations or current generations, when they talk about a preeminent economist, Kautilya should be the first name on the table. And I think that is the main aim, to create an awareness among people. And I hope that awareness is created through this exercise.
Yes, I wanted you to have the last word, but since you brought the topic of reviews, I will reiterate that message for our readers. Buying the book is obviously very important. Reading it is very important, but we often forget the value that a review can add, not only to a general understanding of the book for someone who is looking to make a decision on what book to buy, but I think it is also in terms of, I think, one of the things that Amazon reviews do is, or they have done, is that they have democratized opinion about books. So authors are no longer held beholden to the limited gatekeepers of what thinking should be and like. Obviously, with more information comes the issue of quality, but I think by and large, the more reviews you get about a book, the more informed a decision people can make. So therefore, I'll completely endorse your views, Sriram, that folks, please read the book, buy the book, and review a book. You don't have to write long reviews. Just a short paragraph would do. Why? So what you liked about the book, why you liked about the book, in general, why should someone read and buy this book? And if you don't like something about the book, be specific as to why you didn't like what you didn't like about the book. It doesn't help to just say, I didn't like the book. That doesn't help any, people. I'll stop ranting at this point. Thank you, Sriram, for this wonderful podcast.
Thank you.